All right. I'd like to introduce our next panelists. They're each going to actually discuss their own background, but briefly on my right here is our moderator, John Enright. John is an assistant regional director of the New York Regional Office of the SEC, and he specializes in cybersecurity, which is kind of a hot topic these days. We have Mary Caveny, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Global Cyber Alliance. This was something that DA Vance referred to in his remarks earlier, and we're so happy to have Mary here to discuss her work and the work of Global Cyber Alliance. And then on my left, we have Erik Friedberg, who is the founder of Friedberg, and we are absolutely honored to have Erik here to discuss really the innovative work they've been able to do in this cyberspace. This is such an important issue that so directly relates to public integrity, and we're really just thrilled to have our panelists here today. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Barrett. Good morning, everyone. So this is a tough act to follow, or that was a tough act to follow, but we'll do our best. So as Barrett mentioned, my name is John Enright. I'm a lawyer in the Division of Enforcement at the Securities Exchange Commission here in New York, and I work in the Enforcement Division Cyber Unit, which focuses on all things cyber in capital markets, securities markets. And maybe we'll touch on some of those things in a bit, but I think Mary and Erik can introduce themselves, and then we'll be off to the races.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mary Caveny, and like John said, I work at GCA. It's a not-for-profit designed to make people safer online. But for most of my career, I was a prosecutor, assistant DA, at the State Attorney General's office, and I was a deputy secretary for the last 3 governors coordinating the public safety agency. So I really consider this a public safety initiative.
Good morning. My name is Erik Friedberg. I'm the co-president and co-founder of Friedberg, which is a cybercrime response and digital forensics firm that's headquartered here in Manhattan. I founded it with, I was a former cyber prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn, and I founded the firm with Ed Strauss, who is the head of the FBI's cyber unit, C37 in New York at 26 Federal Plaza. And we formed a consulting firm about 20 years ago, about 2 people. And then we built it to about 600 people in about 15 different cities. So we do essentially cybercrime response and proactive computer security, mostly for private industry and individuals.
Terrific. So, Mary, why don't we start with you? So I understand, as you mentioned, that the Global Cyber Alliance is concerned more generally with kind of the integrity of the internet. So if I have that right, maybe you can explain to everyone what you all are doing.
Certainly. There's a lot of space in cybersecurity, a lot of think tanks, a lot of recommendations and policy shops out there, but that's actually not what we do. We started a not-for-profit 4 years ago about using asset forfeiture that was given to us by Cy Vance Jr. Because his position was that you can't prosecute your way out of cybercrime. You can investigate, you can prosecute, but you are not going to make a marked difference doing it just in the criminal justice system. So we actually create tools, give them away globally. We have membership from 26 countries and 18 sectors. One of our tools that we built is called Quad 9. It's a DNS infrastructure, which is really just the phone book of the internet. For those of you that are non-technical, if you put in buycatfood.com, it'll translate that to an IP address. Mayor de Blasio last summer ordered all guest Wi-Fi in New York City protected by Quad 9, and currently it's making 50 million blocks a day. So while I was a prosecutor most of my career, what I like to think of this is a public safety initiative that you turn on your computer and there's a safer environment for which people all over the world can do business.
Great. And our panel, obviously, we're here to focus on election integrity, and Secretary Johnson spoke to that in response to Ari's last question, and I understand that the Global Cyber Alliance is doing specific work with respect to electoral integrity. So maybe you can flesh that out.
Yes, on Monday, and I invite you all to attend, we are launching a cybersecurity event. We are releasing the cybersecurity toolkit for election infrastructure. And I think it's based on a couple of points. There's better experts in the room than myself, but I think if you really look back and think about the lack of confidence that the voting public has globally, it's really alarming. Only 8% of people worldwide think that their election process is going to be free from cyber attack. And I guess as a prior prosecutor and somebody that did election work, but also just public integrity work, I think about what are the ramifications of that? What is the ripple effect of people not believing in their electoral process? It's not just about democracy, it's about people not running for office. It's about people not voting. And that lack of confidence, I think the implications are endless. So we put together a toolkit along with the elections ISAC. DHS in the last year put up the e-ISAC that works with the electoral districts all over the country. And I would say that this is in no way to be considered a critique on the election officials in election districts. These are dedicated people that actually do not close the polling places even when there's a tornado. They believe very strongly in what they're doing, but they're under-resourced. So this is a simple how-to guide with a series of toolkits in non-technical language that explains to them how to better secure the election process.
Great. So Eric, in the government, Mary's in not-for-profit. You're obviously in the private sector. So what, if anything, is Strauss Friedberg seeing and doing with respect to cyber threats in the election realm?
So the election realm is really a governmental realm. We don't directly have governmental clients, but I think that I'm aware of some of the challenges in that space, and they really pertain to the same challenges that are facing private clients. One of the best government standards that come out that inform how you should really tackle cyber threats is the NIST standard, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and it breaks down cyber protection into 5 different areas. The first area is governance. The second area is protective technologies and processes. The third is detective technologies and processes. The fourth is incident response, and the fifth is recovery. So for most private clients that are sort of what we call on the low end of the maturity curve, which is a fancy way of saying their computer security is horrible.
They're not ready.
Yeah. They face a number of challenges to get up the curve and to prevent and to be able to detect cyber attacks or respond to them. Number one is just governance and the will to do it and the structures that enable good decision making. Number two is money. You need a lot of money because really the things have changed so drastically in the 10 years when we started Strauss Friedberg. You didn't have 20 years ago, there weren't massive numbers of state-sponsored agents and foreign militaries that were a corporation's adversaries, and there wasn't billions of dollars in organized crime money to be made from hacking. Now there is, and there also wasn't a huge amount of geopolitical gain to be had from the result of these hacking operations. Now there is. And so just like private companies, state governments face this exact issue. When I'm talking to state administrators in New York State and elsewhere, they, first of all, from a governance point of view, as I understand it, and this is not, you'll correct me if I'm wrong because it's not totally my area of expertise, but they almost have it worse than the private sector because in terms of what your election machines are going to be doing, right, you have point of sale type of issues, like are the machines secure at the point of processing. Then the results go upstream, and those upstream centers of collection of data are also super vulnerable. And then you've got to then basically protect both. As I understand it, on a state-by-state basis, you could have 20 different types of constituencies that deal with how do you make those machines and the processes secure. So if you have a great idea and a great technology, and you say, I want to impose this technology in this state, first of all, there might be state laws that govern this. There could be 20 different administrators that have a say in whether you change the technology or how you're going to run this process. In order to actually make a decision to improve things, it's almost impossible because you've got 20 different constituencies to sort of bring along. In the private sector, it's not that bad, right? You may have a CEO, you have a CISO, you have a board of directors, and those present challenges as they are. But if you have state statutes, for example, some of the technology or the processes is literally listed in state statutes. So if you say, well, I want to do X, well, you can't do X because you have state statutes that say you can't do that. So that's what under NIST we would call your governance challenges, right? So the governance challenges, I think, in this area are enormous. Then, if you think about this from the private sector, there's an analogy. When we go in and we have the Chinese government or the North Korean government or the Iranian government attacking a corporate enterprise, normally it is 9 months before that attack is detected. Normally by that 9 months, they've basically been able to go anywhere they wanted to go, see anything they wanted to see, and take anything they wanted to take. And so you're coming in and one of the challenges when you're doing private cybercrime is you don't know if they're still there. Yeah. In 80% of the times that you come in for incident response, they're already gone, but you don't know that. So you have to act as if they're still there and sort of ramp up very quickly to try to kick them out, not knowing whether they're there or not.
Is that task one, I would imagine?
That's task one,
yeah.
To figure out whether they are still in there. And one of the challenges is the technology that you need to give you the visibility into whether, one of the reasons that you can't see them for 9 months is most companies, or not most, but companies on the low end of the maturity scale do not have the technology that provides them that visibility. So it's not as if you can run down to Radio Shack and get that technology and plug it in like some USB. That technology can take 2 weeks to 6 months to deploy, and it can be hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars.
Yep.
You have the same issue in elections. In state governments have this exact issue. They have a worse issue, because in the event of a real breach, or as you're planning to increase your maturity and get sort of advanced endpoint protection and things that look for very advanced military type of signatures as they're going across the wire, those are expensive.
Yeah.
So how does a state government go and say, in a tight budget cycle, hey, I need $400,000 every year to have a best-in-class detective technology? So these are challenges that I think. So you have governance, you have governance, you've got money, and then you have expertise. The other issue is, let's say you buy all these tools, you got them, great. You have a $90,000 salary for your cap for your CISO. Well, the CISO market, that $90,000 person in the government, if they have the right skills, can go out and make $400,000 or $500,000 a year. So who do you get in to run your program and to run those tools? So I would say those are the three big challenges: governance, governance, money, and expertise.
Yeah, please, Mary. You were nodding.
If I could just respond to what Eric said, I think, I don't think my press officer likes it when I say this, but there is the cybersecurity poverty line, right? And honestly, a lot of governments fall below that. And at a time when citizens actually expect their governments to lead, especially with respect to protecting their data, it's a problem. I'm probably not the only one in this room that had my data stolen when the federal government contracted out and there was the OPM breach. 4 million Americans lost their clearance, whether you had secret or top secret clearance. It included our fingerprints. So when I went to file my tax returns, someone had already claimed my children. And so that is tolerated less and less now by the citizens of this country and most countries. And so one of the things I would just say with respect to resources and lack thereof by the government is there's a lot that can be done through basic cyber hygiene. And I don't know if you've heard that. It's count, control, configure, patch, repeat. It's basic patching, backup, asset management. And as boring as that sounds, if you can do that, and it relates back to the NIST framework or the CIS critical controls, you can improve your online security by 85%. When Secretary Johnson, before he left office, he declared the election infrastructure critical infrastructure. And one of the things that did was provide resources, and there are clearly not enough resources, and it's clearly an almost unmanageable system based on the bifurcation and the 8,800 election districts that I believe they're in place now. But cyber hygiene is part of the answer, and government leading through best practices of itself and showing its citizens that it's willing to protect their data and the electoral process.
I would just react to that, which is that you might be able to increase your security. I mean, there's two pieces, one piece of bad news and one piece of good news. The bad news is if you increase your security 85%, you've got the Russian military, like the top hackers in the Russian military, are the main adversaries in this area. I mean, you could speak more to empirically whether, whether there are actually live in the wild attacks against these aggregation points. I mean, there's a lot of, first of all, there's a lot of misnomers because, the election hacking, other than the DNC hacking, which was sort of trivial, right? No dual factor authentication on the DNC passwords and Podesta's email. Okay.
Wasn't the password in fact password, or was that just an old wives' tale?
I don't know that.
I read that somewhere.
But if you increase your security somewhat, you're up against these top adversaries, and you really need the top defenses. That's the main problem. And it's an interesting problem because the private sector has had this exact same issue, which is, let's say you're a Fortune 100 media company, right? But you're not J.P. Morgan Chase. Like, I think that J.P. Morgan Chase's security budget when they got hacked became a public thing, and it's an enormous security budget. Even most mid-sized public companies don't have that. How do you go out and buy all these things that will actually give you some fighting chance against the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians, and whoever else? So that's the problem. The good news, I think, and again, I'm looking to you for correct me if I'm wrong, which is that there's a lot of security in obscurity and distribution here. I mean, to some degree, thank God, the system isn't centralized, right? Look at OPM. Like, my Chinese have my fingerprints too. I always think like I'm going to get framed like in the Bourne Identity, right? Where they put my fingerprints on that little circuit breaker, and then I'm going to have all sorts of problems. So you have 50 states, even though it's federal elections, there's no federal election system. It's a state system. And all the states have different systems, and they're all based on different technology. So I think it's a bit of even for the Russians, who I think if they wanted to do it, they probably could. It's hard to get at everything. So now, if I'm the Russians, I'm thinking, well, I mean, and they're pretty smart about this stuff, right? They could say, I don't have to get at everything. Here's my 3 swing states, right? And here's the aggregation points. So I think that's what the threat landscape probably looks like, which is, okay, you don't have to worry about California. I wouldn't do anything in California. They're not going to do anything in New York, right? They're going to go after Pennsylvania. They're going to go after, Colorado or Michigan, et cetera. That's how these states should be thinking about it, because they have limited resources, right? So they're going to go after those kind of states and still distributed. It reminds me of like industrial controls where before, when you used to, go out and try to hack some railroad, right? There'd be a switch out in the middle of the desert that somebody had to go out and turn a big wheel. And now that evolved to these really proprietary systems 20 years ago where they were sort of hard to hack because they weren't Windows systems, they weren't Linux systems. It was sort of security by obscurity, and they were hard to hack. Bad news is they all became Windows systems, right? And they connected half of these things to the corporate environment. So the hackers now come in, they go into the corporate environment, and then they go to the switch and they turn. This happened in Westchester, right? I think those are Russians turned the virtual wheel on a dam in Westchester and opened up the water, right? So it sort of reminds me of that. We're sort of in that area where it's a little bit of a security by obscurity, but eventually it won't be.
How far does it go with state actors? Are they interested in local elections as well?
I would have to defer, because I don't know that there's been a lot of reported, because it's one thing to sort of send out 120 million Facebook ads, right, that people may or may not read and may or may not have had an effect. It's another thing to literally hack the election. Like that starts to, but the interesting thing about cyber is this stuff starts to blur into warfare. And so I don't know. Do you know?
I don't know either, but I think going to your Facebook comment, in the 2016 elections, it's something like 139 million Americans voted. 126 million had Facebook accounts that were somehow at some time or other exposed to Russian propaganda. So I think a lot of it's about perception management, right? Did it have an effect? I don't know. Very possibly. And going to some of Eric's points, the most, vulnerable, the voter databases that are separated from the paper ballots that most of the states are using. Those are quite safe. You can turn people away. You can turn people away just by saying certain sympathetic things about one candidate or the other, very critical things about another. And very possibly it did change the course of, the 2016 election. But it certainly wasn't the first time. Manipulation of our electoral process goes back some time. But I think, too, it's just what is the average person doing? This has socioeconomic implications in all states. One of the things which, and I apologize for getting away from election security for a minute, but I was always taken with this. The hacks against our small and medium businesses in the United States are up 43%. And in 6 months, 60% of those businesses go out of business. So you have, and potentially election districts think the same way, you have small businesses say, I have nothing to steal. Why would anyone hack me? And it's the notion of the hacker. I always envision someone walking down a roadway and just, just getting the car doors that are open, taking which phones and money that are in the car doors that aren't locked. And that's really what cyber theft is about, going after the lowest hanging fruit. And I think that we have to make it much harder for that to occur. But going to Eric's point, election security, is just very, very difficult. And can we, one of the things that I'm critical about the technology field, and I used to say it was job security. I was the person that had the most tickets at the help desk in any job I ever held. I was that person. But why can't we make technology easier to understand? We need to package it and explain it in a way that the decision makers are willing to up their cybersecurity. If the lawyer in charge of the firm, other than Eric's firm, or the lawyer, the supervisor, the governor, if they cannot understand or appreciate the implications of poor cybersecurity, nothing's going to change. So we have to sort of demystify cyber and explain it in a way that actually causes change in behavior and practices.
Are the governmental bodies that you work with, are they getting better? I mean, is there a...
I think so. I mean, we did a campaign a year and a half ago called DeMark in 90 days. It's just to authenticate your emails. And one of the nice things about working for a not-for-profit is you're not bound by the strict guidelines of government entity. People like to say there's government and there's industry, and I like to think of NGOs or not-for-profits sort of going up the middle, sort of seam. And DHS ordered all the agencies to go to DeMark in 90 days, and I think the domains are about 80% now, a year and a half later. But the White House was very slow to move its domains over. And because my boss is brave and works at a not-for-profit, he wrote a blog criticizing the White House. So I think in the expectation, if you expect the government to lead and the government says they're going to lead, they need to lead. And the U.S. was actually just following what the U.K. had done 2 years prior. There are other countries. We are not the top country in cybersecurity readiness. Actually, Singapore is, I believe, still. So I think pushing the government and having a high level of expectation with governments and working with a number of other governments to do similar campaigns is what we need to do.
So Eric, I'm just interested, in terms of techniques that hackers are using, what's kind of the latest and greatest, as it were, that you're seeing, whether it's state actors or organized crime? What types of things are they doing to get at, clients of your firms?
Sure. To some degree, it starts with what Mary was saying, which is if you have, let's say you have the Russian military trying to invade some Fortune 50 company, they will use the absolute simplest, non-technical, non-advanced method that they can.
What we see in our email accounts, phishing scams, and
a phishing scam for one, or if you have some website that's a web server that's not patched correctly, they'll infiltrate that web server. And the basic nature of so you hear a lot of talk about what they call zero-day exploits, like they're cooking up some some malware or virus that nobody's ever heard of. And it was great book called Countdown to Zero Day that talks about the whole industry, the government industry of creating zero-day exploits for use in sort of military cyber warfare. That's sort of at that very, and in fact, it was, I think, part of the Snowden dump involved all these zero-day exploits because the government buys these things from a variety of creative people, put it that way, for a lot of money. The government might spend $100,000 or $200,000 for a single exploit. So they accumulate all these things, and this one of the horrible things about the Snowden dump is that it had all of these private, non-public exploits that the government had either built or acquired. So we have that too, and this is a great book that talks about what the Russians are doing, what the North Koreans are doing, how we and the Israelis use these zero-day exploits to deal with the spin down the Iranian centrifuges. So that's at the super high end. So if you're trying to spin down the Iranian centrifuges, you're probably using the most advanced techniques available. But if you're trying to break into some government agency and you have a simple phishing email that works, why not? Why tip your hand? Why use something that you just spent 200 grand on when something that's completely free and basic will work? So we see a lot of that. I think phishing is probably the number one exploit. Phishing is when you get an email and it has an attachment on it and you shouldn't click on it, or a link in it that you shouldn't click on and you do, and it essentially, one way or another, takes over your username and password, or it drops malware onto your computer if your computer is not well protected. And then the course of a typical advanced attack is that they establish a foothold on your computer, usually either through phishing or through some vulnerability in a website. You didn't patch something that was available to patch 6 months ago. They see it because they can see you didn't patch it because it's visible externally. Right. So then they invade that website. In either case, then they start doing something called lateral movement. They move from that first point of entry and they move laterally, and they set up little listening posts, right? So they set up a little listening post, and if the network is not configured well, usernames and passwords are just flowing on the network by the little listening post. Well, they record all that. They might be encrypted, but it's fairly trivial in most environments to crack that encryption. So they crack that encryption and they start to escalate their privileges, is what it's called. What they're looking for typically as they escalate privileges, so when we come in after the fact or in the middle of the hack, you'll see some point of entry that is visible, but they will probably, the attackers are usually on 30 to 100 different servers. Wow. And they literally start doing reconnaissance and jumping from server. Oh, look what's so interesting over here. What's on this server? What's on? Nothing interesting on this server. Let me move to this other server. So that's called lateral movement. And so eventually what they're doing is they're going onto servers and they're either sniffing credentials or what they call dumping credentials, where there's password files and they dump them, and they're usually encrypted, and then they either export them, crack them, and then come back in, or they can crack them on the servers. They set up a little workshop and they use cracking tools to crack the passwords. They're looking for database administrative credentials, which is what happened in the OEM breach, right? It happened in almost every breaches. Every single front page brief in which these big things get exfiltrated for the most part is eventually the attacker gets to have database administrative credentials. So they're literally setting up shop, like it's like a little tent in a camp, right? And they're like, oh, and they could be sitting on any server. Like I remember in one case, they were sitting on an antivirus server. Had nothing to do with anything, but it's just where they set up camp. But they had database administrative credentials. So now they can act like the database administrator. They start querying the database, which is what happened in OEM. They query the database. They get the database to export the results, like in this case, all of our fingerprints and social security numbers, names, our medical history, blah, blah, blah. Whatever we put in our SF-86s, which was the top secret security form. And then they create a file, and then they zip it up, and they encrypt it, and then they send it out. And that's the exfiltration. And once they do that, they basically usually leave, unless it's like something like Boeing or, where they want to be persistent, or where they want, like when the New York Times got hacked, right? Again, just from reported events, I think they got what they wanted. They were looking for a particular thing, as I understand it, on how the New York Times was going to treat a particular Chinese issue from an editorial perspective. Wow. And I've seen this over and over, and they get that one thing. They could spend like 7 months getting that, then they get it, and they leave. If it's a military contract there, if they get in, they're probably going to stay as long as they can until they get kicked out. Right. But usually it's a smash and grab. They have a particular, and in most situations, there's two aspects of these foreign military operations. There's the break-in crew, and then there's the client. Mm-hmm. So the break-in crew, like the client basically says, let's say it's the Chinese state propaganda, mechanism. They say to the break-in crew, we need to get in and look for X. So the break-in crew goes in and breaks in. Usually they break everything. In other words, they give you complete access to the entire network, even though you're, only looking for 2 megabytes of data. And then they hand the keys over. What we're also seeing is there's a connection between now, it used to be just military. The Russians have started to collaborate with Russian organized crime. And so the Russian organized crime guys are the break-in crew. They hand the access back to the state government apparatus to get what they want for intelligence purposes. And then they let the Russian organized crime guys go in and get whatever they want to monetize.
Grab the money, yeah.
Grab the money.
So I think just one last quick question. I'll do my best Ari Melber impersonation because we talked about this before we started. So what from each of you, what's your sense of kind of the risk or threat of a really bad national, federal cybersecurity attack in the next 10 years? I think the window was.
I mean, I'm very fearful. I'm Irish, so the glass is always half empty. But it's really about the Internet of Things, and that the attack, and we haven't talked much about that, but the attack vector is so broad and so expansive, and the security is not being built in to any of our devices that we rely on daily. So whether it's, as Erik said, an attack on a SCADA system that runs, a nuclear plant, whether it's a baby monitor. Recently, I worked with a large jurisdiction that inventoried their IoT devices, and they came up to 1 million different IoT devices. So I think it is very likely there's going to be a broad-scale attack that can affect our way of life.
Is the question domestically or internationally?
Domestically, but I'm curious to hear what you're thinking internationally.
Well, so internationally, the really bad stuff has already happened.
Oh, coming from internationally.
I mean for an international victim. So, for example, Russia shut down the entire Ukrainian electrical grid,
right,
for example. So that kind of stuff has... I think that the main deterrent is there's some détente, between these big actors. Like Russia and China are probably the biggest threats. North Korea is mostly looking at this point to hack for money, to finance, things that it wants to do. It's the nuclear weapons program because of the sanctions, because they can't get, dollars and other types of funds. So they're looking to monetize. So I think there's less of a major threat like that. The Russians and the Chinese are, in a more tenuous position. I mean, that would start to be a tantamount to an act of war, and that they're taking a huge risk. Not that they couldn't do it. And by the way, we could also do it to them.
Yep.
So I think it's unlikely that you're going to see somebody, disable the cooling on a nuclear plant and cause a 3 Mile Island, or shut down the East Coast or the West Coast electrical grids in the middle of winter. And I don't think you're going to see that just because of the consequences to that. I think each side already has the capability to do any of that to each other.
Got it. Well, good news. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, happy to, of course.
I guess what I would say is that the multi-state ISAC has been around 15 years, and that's where DHS tries to make all state and local governments safer, and the EISAC is based off that. It's not perfect, but it's early warning. All 50 states are a member. And I think anything that an NGO like myself is trying to do is just to supplement that. I'll give you my card. Maybe you can come to our event Monday. But it is about awareness, and DHS is working on it through the election ISAC, both through the vendor community and the election districts themselves. But I agree with you, there is a generational issue, there's a lack of knowledge issue, and there's a lack of resource issue, which can create a perfect storm. But I think that there's a number of efforts, but we have a long way to go. I hear your concerns.
What aspect of cryptocurrency? I didn't hear that question. Well, I don't have any opinion on whether Facebook should do that or whether that's a good thing, or I know nothing about their proposed platform. I think, look, the big challenges for cryptocurrency in the cyber world is the anonymous nature of the financial transactions. So we see, for example, in ransomware cases and cyber extortion cases, all of the payments are being demanded in and paid in, to the extent that they are paid, in cryptocurrency. So I think that's an issue for government regulators and AML regulators. I do not understand how cryptocurrency is sort of somehow outside of anti-money laundering strictures, apparently, but that's above my pay grade, I think. I think that's the main issue from a cybercrime perspective, is that it facilitates all sorts of illicit cyber activity.
Yeah, I can just add, Eric, to your point. Oh, you okay?
Yeah, sorry.
You okay?
Yeah, the chair broke.
It's a random.
I really gotta go on a diet.
No. Here's a cable.
Oh, okay.
You're good.
Okay, good, I'm good.
Good. So I can just to add to that threat, as Eric says, everything is anonymous. I mean, it's a weird conundrum, or proponents of blockchain technology, will tell you that it's all kind of open and notorious. That's the idea. It's decentralized and you can see it, but what you can see are just 50-character hashtags, right? And you can only find out who's behind that hashtag unless and until the assets go to, say, a domestic exchange that does KYC, and law enforcement can go and see who that person is. But it's also very international, and there are digital asset exchanges in jurisdictions, not surprisingly, like China, Russia, et cetera. So if the assets go to Russia and they come out of Russia, it's obviously outside of the grasp of U.S. law enforcement. So.
And I would just add one thing to your point. I'll sign a waiver later, Barrett. So I'm the clumsiest person I know. But I think going to Eric's point is about anonymity. And New York State actually was the first, I believe, the first state to file regulations to treat cryptocurrency as a security. And so I think it is to the government to not just let it be this side issue and to regulate it as such, because it quite frankly, it facilitates crime, just as Erik said.
The census is going to be collected online this next year for the first time. What do you think is being done, because that is more centralized, obviously, than elections? It's being done by the federal government. Have you heard anything about what's being done to keep that secure?
I have not. That's outside of my area expertise.
I'm sorry, mine too.
That doesn't bode well. but hopefully, fingers crossed, I suppose.